Hi, and welcome to this short video on culture and change for the core management concepts module. Organisational culture is a topic that we cover in the unit on culture and change, and it's just worth reminding you of a definition of it because we'll then use this idea for the rest of this lecture. So Shine, who is a leading writer on the topic of organisational culture, defines organisational culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. So in other words, by a group who are trying to overcome the challenges of existing in the wider world and gelling together as a group. And it's a pattern that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think and feel in relation to those problems. So it's kind of a system almost that's been developed from dealing with previous obstacles, challenges and ways of doing things. And Shine, the same writer, talks about there being three levels of culture. There's the basic assumptions that are shared by everyone in the organisation without necessarily realising what those are. There are the values, which are the things that you can say. So we're a happy organisation, we're an innovative organisation. And there are the artefacts, which you can physically see and touch. They're the things that make up the organisation's visual and tangible landscape. So if we look at artefacts then, they're in any visual or verbal element in an organisation. It could be architecture, furniture, dress code, office jokes, logos and so forth. They can be recognised by people not part of the culture, although not necessarily correctly. The values are the organisation's stated values and rules of behaviour, which are often expressed in official philosophies and public statements of identity. So in the case of McDonald's, who you may or may not have guessed, the photos were of on the previous slide, they talk about being here to feed and foster communities as one of their core values. So it can sometimes be a projection of the future and of what members hope to become. So John Lewis talk about never knowingly undersold. McDonald's talk about this idea of fostering communities. Education providers might think about building success stories. Google used to talk about not being evil. They're all really short examples. If you Google value statements, you will find plenty of others. And when you looked at strategy, you also saw a number of value statements. And then the third, the lower level, is the shared basic assumptions. And these are deeply embedded, taken for granted behaviours, which are usually unconscious. So people in the organisation don't necessarily know they hold them, but they constitute the essence of culture. And these assumptions are often so well integrated or ingrained in the organisational dynamic that they're hard to recognise internally and externally. So you might say, for example, in McDonald's, that good McDonald's employees are serious about their jobs and stars matter. And it's almost a way of dealing with the ridicule that often McDonald's employees face in a culture or fast food workers face in a culture. So building up this kind of defensive armour and this way of thinking about the stars on your badge that show that you're very capable of what you do, that they matter, that you care about this job. And so good long-term McDonald's employees really embody that value. Another way to think about culture is to think about this idea of the competing values framework. And what you can see is a quadrant which measures along two lines. One is a line around flexibility versus stability, and the other is around whether you're focused internally and very integrated or focused externally and differentiated. And you end up with four composite cultures as a result. So a clan, where the aim is very much collaboration and you want cohesion, which allows you to create people development. An adhocracy, where the aim is creation, creativity. You get there through adaptability and eventually it leads to innovation. A hierarchy, where the aim is control and you get there through process control and it leads ultimately to efficiency. And a market culture, where the aim is to compete. You do it through productivity and it ultimately ends in a greater market share. And we can look at particular companies that fit in each culture. So a clan culture, so remember that's all about being part of a group, being very much centered around working together and cohesion and collaboration. John Lewis partnership is very much of that vein. An adhocracy, where it's very much about looking externally, being differentiated and being very flexible. It's often hard to pick this out in large organisations that we would all have heard of, because they need to be somewhat bureaucratic. However, you can see some features of the adhocracy in Netflix and in Google, where they try and differentiate themselves from one another. They do allow workers a great deal of flexibility and discretion relative to their size. A hierarchy culture is where you've got lots of internal focus and integration, very tight, clear processes, and a great deal of stability and control. And the NHS or any very large government-led bureaucracy would be an excellent example of a hierarchy culture. And then finally, a market culture where it's all about competing, all about competition and being the market leader. A really good example of that would be Amazon. So different cultures, different flavors of culture will lead to a very different feel working inside those companies. It will feel very, very different culturally working in the NHS in comparison to Netflix and Google, or in John Lewis in comparison to Netflix, or Amazon in comparison to the NHS. So any of those two pairs, I've chosen fairly extreme examples for each of them. You may find that you don't fit the culture of one of those types of organisations, or you're particularly suited to one type. And so they're kind of good examples of those cultures, and those cultures will make organisations feel very different, because if we go back to this definition, those shared basic assumptions will be fundamentally different, and what's worked well enough to allow them to achieve their aims will be fundamentally different. And therefore the way that they teach things to new members in terms of how to perceive, think and feel in relation to problems will again be very much different. So now we just flip on to thinking not specifically about culture, but about large-scale culture change. And Lewin, who wrote about the topic of culture change, said that we should think about change in three major stages. Firstly, unfreezing. So this is where we know that we want to change our company because things aren't working as well as they could be. And we need to encourage people to start to change. We want to melt down the rigid organisation, the ice block. And then once we've got to the stage where it's unfrozen, we need to change things. We need to explain to people what we want them to do instead. And so that then they can get organised into their new shape. And so then we can refreeze them and create an expectation that they're going to keep doing the thing that we've asked them to do instead, and putting support mechanisms in place. So we have a new rigid structure, a new different ice cube. So how can leaders help with this process? Well, firstly, it's important they help with unfreezing. And there are three major modes of activity that they can undertake to help with that. Firstly is disconfirmation. So this is where you say, we're not succeeding. Data says we're not succeeding, things are going badly and we need to do something about it. So rather than confirming that everything's great, you're disconfirming it. You're saying, no, things are going wrong. Secondly is survival anxiety. So creating a sense in people that it's really serious and that the company or the department or whatever it is you're looking to change is going to be dead in the water if something isn't done soon. And then the third element that a manager can help to unfreeze by using is psychological safety. So that's the sense that it's going to feel uncomfortable, being clear with people this isn't going to be a comfortable process, but that it's okay to make a mistake, and making people feel as though you've got their back. Well, hopefully you found that helpful, with just a little bit on culture and a little bit on change, hopefully to add to the materials that you've been given as notes and round out some of that learning. Thanks for listening.